pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
God bless America.
God bless America. Thank you. Folks, as always, we'd like to introduce a little bit about who we are and what we do and why we do what we do here in terms of trying to save the country here. But the Palm Beach County Tea Party is a nonprofit group that does not endorse individual candidates, but which stands for the following three principles: free markets, constitutionally limited government, and fiscal responsibility. That is the heart and soul of who we are. We have three chapters. One chapter is in Jupiter, one is in Wellington, and of course this is the Boca chapter, in case you don't know where you are. I'm Alex Berry, and I'm the Boca chapter coordinator, and I'm glad again to see everybody out here expressing your patriotism. Even just by coming out here, you're making a difference, and you are to be applauded for that and for taking a stand. That's right, give yourselves a hand. We have 273 days now until the election where America will ultimately decide what kind of country it wants to be. Do we want to be a collectivist, big government, cradle-to-grave oligarchy? No. Or do we want to be the republic that our founding fathers originally intended, with focus on American exceptionalism and individualism?
And obviously the goal is a society based on individual freedom and the pursuit of happiness. And I think there's just a big divide between conservatives and progressives on this. You know, progressives say, the Constitution, it's so old. I mean, this is 1787. They didn't have airplanes or the internet or automobiles. How could something be done in 1787 now be relevant to our times today? And this is a point I often make, and more fodder for kind of the canon. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, a very liberal Supreme Court justice, was recently asked. She gave a television interview in Egypt, and they asked, well, Justice Ginsburg, what can we take from kind of the American Constitution when we're writing constitutions in Egypt? And she said that she wouldn't look to the American Constitution for any inspiration or guidance. She said she would look at like the South African Constitution or the European Charter on Human Rights for inspiration, but that ours is kind of old. And, true to form, a point I've been making just in time for this speech, the New York Times today, an article titled, "We the People are basically saying that the rest of the world doesn't look to our Constitution anymore, they view it as outmoded." So here's the New York Times. "The United States Constitution is terse and old, and it guarantees relatively few rights. The commitment of some members of the Supreme Court to interpret the Constitution according to its original meaning may send the signal that is of little current use to, say, a new African nation, and the Constitution's waning influence may be part of a general decline in American power and prestige." And they go on to complain that the rights guaranteed by the American Constitution are parsimonious by international standards, and they are, quote, frozen in amber. Furthermore, Americans recognize certain rights, this is the Times complaining, that few other countries protect, such as the right to bear arms. And the Constitution, they say, is out of step with the rest of the world in failing to protect, at least in so many words, a right to travel, the presumption of innocence, which that's not even true, and entitlement to food, education, and health care. So this is a timely battle about just what are the foundations of our country? Are these enduring truths, or are they just kind of timepieces that were good enough to get us out of 1787 into the 1790s and into the 1800s, and now we just need to kind of walk away from those principles? And I think that is a huge dividing line, because the progressive says, well, the Constitution can't mean what it meant then. It's got to be kind of reinterpreted and essentially amended, I think, by judges and other certain elites. And I think ultimately that misses the boat, because the reason why America is exceptional, the reason why our country has gone from really a backwater in the world in the 18th century to the most powerful nation in the history of the world, is because the Founding Fathers founded it on certain principles that are true. It's not a question of old or new, it's a question of right or wrong, truth versus falsity. The Times article, when you start talking about rights and how the Founding Fathers viewed it, they would never have said that you have a constitutional right to housing or food. And the reason why they wouldn't do that is because that doesn't really help individual liberty in the broadest sense. If I have a right to receive certain welfare payments to the government, well, where does that have to come from? There's not just some separate fund that just appears where I can just take it from the government. It's got to come from somebody else's pocket. And so if you're giving me this right to receive all this from the government, you're also mandating that the government is able to go in and essentially get into your pocket and take money from you as a matter of constitutional right. So if you think it helps my liberty that I'm receiving this assistance, it hurts other people's liberty because now they have no choice but to be able to pay it. Also notice, when you're talking about receiving these kinds of benefits as being a liberty, as people on the left, like the Times author and others do, it depends on really how you slice that. I mean, if I'm receiving certain government benefits and I become dependent on those benefits, well, guess what? The government's giving, it can tell me to jump. And what's my response got to be if I'm truly dependent on this? Okay, how high do I have to jump? And so the government then has huge power to shape your behavior, to force you to act in certain ways, and to restrict your behavior in other ways. This president just has a different worldview than the worldview of the Founding Fathers, and how I think he departs from really some of the fundamental truths that our country is founded on. You go back to the absolute bedrock of the society about being endowed by God with certain inalienable rights, including the right to pursue happiness. That means at a minimum that you have a right to work, you have a right to the fruits of your own labor, you have the right as an individual to accumulate property, to deploy your capital as you see fit. The role of the government under this view is to protect your economic freedom and to foster a growing economy and wealth creation. The Founding Fathers never bought into any of this class warfare rhetoric. In fact, they discussed it at the Constitutional Convention. They said, okay, we believe that all men are created equal. So what does that mean? Does that mean that you're going to have equal results because everyone's created equal? And they said, not only did they say no, they said, you know what? If you had a free society, you cannot possibly have equal results. And the reason is because different people are endowed with different talents. Some people work harder than others. Some people are willing to take risks while others are not. There's all these different factors that go into it. And so they rejected the idea that you could have an equality of outcomes. In fact, they said if you have equal outcomes, then they know for sure that you do not have a free society. Now contrast that with Obama. He believes that the government is really an instrument of wealth destruction and income redistribution. And you see this with the Keystone Pipeline that was recently scuttled. It had passed all these environmental impact standards. There was no question that it could have been done. And the State Department was the one that held it up. Now we have gas that's what, $3.50 a gallon. We need to have more domestic energy. This is essentially, I would say, domestic because Canada's a friendly nation. And they scuttled it. So that's basically putting more burdens on the American people. It's keeping a lot of jobs. But that's kind of, what he sees government's role as doing. And he also, of course, is just fixated on raising taxes on, quote, the wealthy. But notice when he talks about this, and in the book I really hold him accountable for the words that he uses. He said in the past that cutting taxes represents a transfer of wealth that we just can't afford. Now just think what that means. If I reduce your tax rate, I'm simply, as the government, not taking as much as I did the year before. I haven't transferred you anything. But in his mind, he sees a reduction in your tax rate as a transfer of wealth from the government to the taxpayer. The only way that could possibly make sense is if you think that government has the first claim of right on what is generated in society. So if government is the number one person, government has the right to the fruits of others' labor. By government reducing your tax rate, government is now transferring its wealth to you. Now that turns kind of the basic understanding of the Founding Fathers completely on its head. Now Obama, it's very interesting. I talk in my book, he gave an interview in the 90s when he was running for state senate, and he criticized Americans because he said they rely too much on pursuing individual dreams and they're too resistant to submitting to collective institutions. And even as president, he said success in America is akin to winning the lottery. And just in December, when he gave a speech in Kansas, he said that hard work has stopped paying off for many Americans. And so I'm just thinking, why would you say that hard work doesn't pay off? I mean, what kind of a signal is that sending to some poor kid somewhere who's thinking about whether he should work hard in school, or someone who's a little older who's worried about whether they should take on a second job to try to put some money away? Why would he say that? Why would he say success is like winning the lottery? And I think the signal he's trying to send is, hey, don't really worry about pursuing your own individual dreams. You're not going to probably get ahead by doing that. Just settle for being a cog in my collective institutions, the redistributive schemes that I create for you. You can't go. So again, you would not have anybody in the founding era that would have allowed the government to have essentially an unlimited regulatory power. If you stood up in one of the ratifying conventions and say, yeah, this power to regulate interstate commerce, I think you all should ratify the Constitution because, if you're doing nothing, it gives the government the power to force you to engage in commerce. The Constitution wouldn't have been ratified. They would have voted it down if people thought that that's what it could do. And then we see now the administration with the Catholic hospitals, essentially forcing them under Obamacare to provide certain services and certain products that violate the conscience, violate the teachings of the church. And so it's putting the edifice of Obamacare over and above a right to worship, which is just one of the most fundamental rights that there are. And the White House says, well, look, we've struck the appropriate balance between freedom of conscience and Obamacare. You don't have the right to abridge people's freedom of conscience in that way. You don't have the right to strike the appropriate balance. Under the framers' view, under his view, hey, he determines which right. So he's going to give you a little bit here, a little bit there, and you should just be happy with that. But note, Obamacare, this is just the beginning if it's not repealed. You're going to see regulations out the wazoo. There's going to be 10, 20 times more regulations that have been put out thus far. And it's going to get itself into all aspects of American society, and if it's the choice between your personal liberty and the power of Obamacare, what do you think is going to win out? The power of Obamacare. Another fundamental principle was that we have a government of laws, not a government of men. The rule of law was of paramount importance to the Founding Fathers. It's what separates a society that respects individual liberty from one that does not respect individual liberty. I mean, you look at the whole American Revolution, taxation without representation. They didn't have the ability to hold it for any representation. They could not stop those taxes that would be imposed on them. Those taxes were not really that burdensome, but it was the principle that was involved. They knew if they allowed the crown to get into their pockets just a little bit without them being able to stop it, then they were essentially giving up their entire liberty because they knew government would continue to take more, and more. And they were very sensitive to that fact. I don't think if we had the public that we do now back then, that people would have reacted in the same way, because people are not as sensitive about those types of things as the Founding Fathers were. We see the same thing with Solyndra, the green energy company. $500 million loan from the taxpayer. The law that allows the government to give those loans says, hey, you get the loan, but the taxpayer gets paid back first. It's clear as day in the law. Well, when it became clear that the company was going to go belly up, what did the administration do? They put the private investors ahead of the taxpayer. Who are these private investors by and large? Contributors to the Democratic Party and Barack Obama. So again, you have a clear rule of law that says you're not allowed to subordinate the taxpayer, then you have the taxpayer subordinate. And so for me, as we look into kind of this crucial election year, I think that all the typical issues are very important. The spending level of government, the taxing level of government, other issues that percolate. But the fundamentals of our country, I think, are really up for grabs in many respects. And when you start talking about whether we're actually dedicated to individual liberty, when you start questioning whether we even have constitutional limitations on government, when you wonder whether the rule of law is of paramount importance, or whether we're just progressivism by any means necessary, it's really, the stakes are very high, because you can have bad policies. Those are easy to correct. When you start allowing some of the fundamentals to break down, that is going to be very difficult to reestablish and to recover. One of my favorite speeches is given by a founding father named Gouverneur Morris. He wrote the preamble to the Constitution. He spoke out against slavery at the Constitutional Convention, and he was talking, this is kind of after the country got started, after the Constitution was ratified. He was talking about national greatness and the national spirit and the love of liberty that people needed to have in America in order for us to be a great country. But he was optimistic about what would happen, and he said he looked forward to the day when in the remotest regions of the world it would be sufficient to command respect simply to say, I am an American. What does it mean to be an American? And I think when Morris said that, he believed it to mean, hey, you're an American, people are going to respect that because of what you stand for. Because you believe in God-given rights. You believe that individual liberty and the pursuit of happiness should be the central focus of society. You believe government's power needs to be limited. We believe in the rule of law rather than the rule of individual men. And so we're asking now, what is the content of our character as a nation? What does it mean for us to be Americans?